the word for the week is renewal. We've spent a couple of weeks now on the early modern era. We spent a lot of time learning about some of the big leaders of the Protestant Reformation. Figures like Martin Luther and Ulrich Zwingli, John Calvin, Henry VIII, Queen Elizabeth, Thomas Cranmer, and many others. We've looked at how different efforts at reforming the Roman Catholic Church in Europe ended in many distinct Protestant movements that broke away from the church, sometimes on their own, and sometimes by being kicked out, and eventually we looked at how it led to new branches of the church family tree. Now, in a very short period of time, Europe went from having basically one common form of Christian worship and set of Christian theologies that, sure, they may vary from place to place and from religious order to religious order, but they were basically tied together by the same authority structures, the same practices, the same church holidays, etc. We went from that to looking at the church in many different forms, to having Lutherans, Calvinists, Anglicans, Arminians, Unitarians, Quakers, Mennonites, Puritans, Anabaptists, Adamites, Muggletonians, and that's not even close to listing them all. So we went from a general consensus to just many, many different forms of Christianity. One of the potentialities and the problems of Protestant reform is this: Protestants never stop reforming. Sometimes it's obvious that there's a clear theological reason for the schism. For example, Luther's 95 Theses, or maybe there's an obvious political reason, as in the case of the Anglicans. Or maybe there's just a clear conflict in terms of biblical interpretation, as is the case of Zwingli's ideas about proper worship practices. But sometimes there's smaller differences, issues of taste, personality differences, or even a family grudge. One of the painful truths is that Protestant reformers are never done. They discovered this over time. Even when more and more people were able to read the Bible for themselves, Protestants just could not come to an agreement about really important things like when to baptize. Lutherans favored infant baptism, but the Anabaptists favored adult baptism. Both thought that their choice was more biblically sound. They also differed when it came to who was in charge of making decisions for the church and what the relationship between the church and the state, or the church and the government, ought to be. England, for example, had a head of state that was also the head of the church. Puritans, if you remember, were dissenters to that same church, and many were forced into exile. They also differed when it came to how to worship and experience God. Some argued that the sacraments were still a place where we experience the grace of God and are changed into the likeness of God. Others argued that the Spirit of God could not be contained in one ritual. Some argued that the most profound form of spiritual formation was found by reading the scriptures. There were as many takes on how to experience God as there were different takes on Christian theology and the Bible. But Protestants were not the only ones wrestling with how to love and serve and be faithful to God in the modern world. Roman Catholics were also wrestling with many of the same questions, and they were exploring how to live faithfully in the modern world. They didn't break away, and so we don't call them reformers, but many historians refer to the early modern era as a time of spiritual and structural renewal in the Roman Catholic Church. We will explore a few of these renewalists today. As we learned over the last few weeks, the Protestant Reformation was tied to specific areas in Europe. The magisterial reforms, or reforms that enjoyed the support of the local government, were centered for the most part in Switzerland and Germany, and then even a bit later in England. In England, we get a form of Protestantism that is an attempt to establish a middle way between hardcore reformers and Roman Catholic traditionalists. At the same time that all these reforms are going on, there are changes happening within the Roman Catholic Church, especially in staunch Catholic nations like France, Spain, and Portugal. You may remember from the last few weeks that there were plenty of Roman Catholics who believed that there were some things about the church that needed to change, and they wanted to change how they did certain things. People like Dutch Reformed Catholic philosopher and also humanist like Calvin, Desiderius Erasmus. He argued for a lot of the same changes that people like Luther called for. Many of the biggest calls for renewal and reform came from monasteries. And that's actually not a huge surprise for several reasons. For one thing, monasteries were institutions, not unlike our universities today, that they were homes for some of the top intellectuals in the world, some really big important thinkers who were interested in discerning how to follow God faithfully in the early modern world. So many intellectual giants of the age, people like Teresa of Avila, John of the Cross, Luis de Granada, these people lived and worked and thought in a monastery or convent. Second, in addition to being intellectual centers or intellectual hubs, the monastic system was also a center of religious revival and reform throughout their history. Monasteries and convents were homes to intellectuals who were also activists. The history of Roman Catholicism is actually full of stories of powerful religious orders like the Benedictines being agents of extraordinary good in the world, healing the sick, providing relief for the poor, educating church leaders, preserving the most sacred texts, including, of course, the Bible, endowing the arts, creating music for church and worship in the world, and much, much more. But of course, like any powerful institution, monasteries and convents were subject to corruption over time in some cases. In Christendom, or during that era when the church was the primary source of authority throughout Europe, religious orders like the Benedictines, for example, became very powerful enough to challenge the strongest earthly rulers of the day in terms of their wealth and even sometimes in terms of their military power. And some within them believed that the order had lost sight of their original visions of taking on a life of poverty, worshiping God, studying the scriptures, praying and interceding for the good of the church, or doing the simple duties of working the land. For example, there were groups like the Cistercians, a group that began as a splinter from the Benedictines, named for their French home city of Citeaux, founded in the 11th century. They believed that they were following the Benedictine order more closely than the Benedictines themselves. They tried to revert to Benedict's original goal of a commune of people who engaged in physical labor as a spiritual discipline. In an effort to counter what they saw as corruption due to the Benedictines' wealth, they sought to adopt an austere life, nothing fancy, just loving, working, praying, and serving God. But monasteries were an unwieldy business. It's hard to keep your eye on the ascetic life when you have farms to run and people to feed, and when you're gaining a lot of power. It might seem easier when you're doing this as a hermit. I'm sure a lot of pastors can relate to that. There were other really well-known orders of women and men who saw wealth in particular as a danger. After all, Jesus said the love of money is the root of all evil, and they formed what were called mendicant orders. Mendicants, which in Latin means begging, valued poverty, and famous mendicants like Italian St. Francis and St. Clare in the 13th century believed in devoting their lives to preaching repentance and poverty, and many rejected having a permanent home and instead traveled around preaching and evangelizing. Around the same time, or a little after, when people like John Calvin and Thomas Cranmer were working out the magisterial reforms in Switzerland and the English reforms in England, people like Teresa of Avila were reforming the Carmelite nuns in what is now known as Spain. Teresa was born into a life of privilege. She was a noblewoman from Salamanca, Spain. At the age of 20, so close in age to many of you who are students right now, she entered religious life. She became a leading Carmelite nun, and she sought to institute several reforms that were meant to be a return to the order's initial objectives of poverty and prayer, rather than what it had developed into over time, which was in some places wealthy nuns who had servants and had their friends over for fun. She was especially concerned with what she saw as spiritual complacency. Teresa worked to create a kind of spiritual community wherein ecstatic experiences with God, mystical visions that had close intimacy with Jesus could thrive. One of the most remarkable things about Teresa of Avila is that she herself had an intense mystical relationship with God. She had extraordinary visions, and you're going to read some of those experiences this week. She was also a fierce intellectual, because you can be both. And she wrote a lot about her life with God in her autobiography that is filled with fascinating details about her relationship with God. I want to share a prayer written by her with you today that's still widely used in Roman Catholic and Protestant circles. And I thought it was especially applicable to students who are in the thick of schoolwork and the semester. And here it is. Let nothing disturb you. Let nothing frighten you. All things are passing. God never changes. Patience obtains all things. Who possesses God lacks nothing. God alone suffices. Let nothing disturb you. Let nothing frighten you. All things are passing. God never changes. Patience obtains all things. Who possesses God lacks nothing. God alone suffices. Sometimes it's important to slow down and remember that God alone suffices, even in disturbing or frightening times. Teresa was not the only Roman Catholic interested in reforming and renewing the church. There were many, many, many others, and many of them came from the same part of the world, from Spain and Portugal. John of the Cross, another Spanish mystic, was really influenced by Teresa of Avila, and he was also interested in spiritual renewal, and he was very interested in reform efforts around that same time in the 16th century. He's most famous for an extraordinarily beautiful and painful and poignant poem that we now call Dark Night of the Soul. Its famous opening line, translated in English, reads, "In an obscure night, fevered with love's anxiety, oh hapless, happy plight, I went, none seeing me, forth from my house where all things quiet be." John of the Cross, like Teresa of Avila, was interested in the Christian's mystical union with God, and he wrote about the soul's journey through intense suffering to that place of union. I would encourage you, especially if you are going through a season of difficulty, to read his work. John of the Cross wrote theological work, treatises, on this poem, which is fascinating because it's an instance of art-inspiring theology, and his words continue to shape Christian spirituality today. Now, there were many, many, many more Roman Catholics who explored spiritual renewal in this era. There were people like Luis de Granada, who wrote the Book of Prayer and Meditation in 1539, which was a step-by-step guide for teaching prayer. There were also people like Ignatius of Loyola, who you will read a lot about this week, a former soldier who, after being wounded in battle, founded the Society or Company of Jesus, otherwise known as the Jesuits. Ignatius of Loyola was interested in imaginative contemplation, this idea where you imagine a detailed encounter with Christ. Jesuits were not confined to the monasteries. They worked in the world. The world, not the cloister, was their home. Ignatius urged his followers to find God in all things, and so the Jesuits went worldwide. They went across Europe, they went into the Middle East, and they founded many institutions of learning as they went. In fact, there's probably a good chance that many of you students here at George Fox came from a Jesuit institution.